Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on the planet. Welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation. You know, the built environment, particularly office buildings and other urban facilities, are responsible for 39% of the global energy-related carbon emissions, according to the World Green Building Council. And about a third of that impact comes from the initial construction of a building, while the other two-thirds is produced over the lifetime of that building through heating, cooling, providing power to the occupants, and all the other energy uses involved, as well as the materials that come and go from the building. Our guest today is leading a key battle to reduce the impact of the built environment. Rob Bernard is the Chief Sustainability Officer at CBRE Group Incorporated, which manages more than $145 billion worth of commercial buildings and provides logistics, retail, and corporate office services to more than 62 million square feet of space. Rob cut his sustainability teeth at Microsoft, where he served as its chief environmental strategist for 11 years. That was while the company was developing its world-leading approach to sustainability and collaborating with other tech giants to lobby for policy and funding to accelerate environmental progress. We'll talk a little about Microsoft, but mostly about CBRE's sustainability solutions and services for commercial building owners and companies. Rob has more hands-on experience with day-to-day sustainability management than most people, and after an earlier conversation we had, he was gracious enough to join me for a conversation on the show. You can learn more about CBRE and its sustainability solutions at CBRE.com. Now, let's get to the conversation after a brief commercial break. Welcome to the show, Rob. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Mitch. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and thanks. After our first conversation, I was really intrigued and wanted to share what you were telling me with everybody who's listening. You're responsible for the oversight of the implementation of CBRE's environmental policies, and I'm wondering what spurred the company to recognize that sustainability was important to its business as well as that of its clients.
Well, I think, I can't really speak for the company prior to my arrival, but I will say that immediately upon my arrival, it was very clear that the company was investing a lot of time and money, but in sort of a disjointed way where multiple teams around the globe were trying to solve the immediate needs for their individual clients. And for a company which is global in nature and has, literally over several billion square feet under management, it really started to become apparent that if we weren't thinking about this, or the company prior to my arrival, if they weren't thinking about it as a holistic challenge and opportunity, we were missing our ability to actually service what the clients need, which is a whole systems end-to-end set of solutions around how do they attack their commercial real estate sustainability challenges.
Well, I would imagine, too, that disjointed approach was a lot more expensive than doing it in a systematic way. Is this actually a way of saving money on delivering these services by consolidating the effort?
And the answer is probably yes, because it's just a natural rule of efficiency.
Sure.
But I think what it is with any given amount of resource, so I think if we just took a big step back on sustainability, which is driving sustainability at scale takes a huge amount of people and a huge amount of capital. So whatever that base is, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find somebody working in sustainability who says, oh, I've got an excess of capital, I've got an excess of people. So we looked at it as, or at least I looked at it as, if there's 750 people around the company working on sustainability, which is about the number, how do we actually leverage those people and provide the platform to go faster and further with our clients?
That raises a question. There's a general criticism of industry's efforts, but as you point out, this is a matter of first learning how to do it, optimizing the process, and just getting better and better. Where do you think we are as an economy?
It's really interesting because I've been at this, for over 15 years. And so I'd say we've come a long way down the learning curve. It's almost like a learning curve, which is back to what I was just talking about. How much can you do with a given set of resources? And the answer is I can do a lot more today in 2024 than I could in 2008 with a given amount of resources. And the key things are that in many cases, we cross the economic threshold. And by that, I mean, historically, if you wanted to do something in sustainability, you were often faced with Am I willing to put in capital with subpar returns to get the outcome I want? Versus today, while it is still true in some cases, in many cases, it's like, it's in my economic self-interest to do the thing that's also sustainable. And that is where I'd say we've crossed that threshold in multiple areas, not all areas in sustainability. And that drives a totally different tempo of what we're doing.
So you see the pace increasing too.
Pace is increasing exponentially.
Now, you spent more than a decade at Microsoft leading their environmental strategy. What were the most important lessons you took away from working in that extremely forward-looking environment, and one where a lot of risk was taken before anyone knew this would pay off?
It's interesting. I think there's an underlying assertion in your statement that I might challenge just a little bit, which is the common perception is that it was high risk, right? But if you sort of flip the narrative a bit and say, well, if we know that there's an inevitability to a long-term outcome, right? So even back in 2008, it wasn't like climate science was a mystery. And it wasn't like, because the European states were implementing different kinds of carbon schemes. So there was almost a certainty, it was certainly a high probability that a few things would be true. There'd be more regulation, there'd be more pressure on companies, there'd be more capital flow. So the question is, when's the right time to jump in with both feet and go as fast as is prudent, right? And so maybe there was risk in an individual decision taken in 2010, which you would do something different in 2024. But from a conceptual level, the sooner you get going, provided you're not on the bleeding edge, there's a big difference, bleeding edge, leading edge. I think it's all on what your time horizon is for risk.
I have the impression, though, that at Microsoft, you were on the bleeding edge. What was that like?
It was fascinating. It was fun. It's nice of you to say, I don't know if we were on the bleeding edge, leading edge. I'd say we were somewhere in that zip code.
When I was at Microsoft, we like to think so. So just let me put it that
way. We definitely like to think so, but it was great because I had the flexibility in some ways too, when you're on that leading edge, to try things that are nonlinear, because there's not an expectation like, oh, well, the rest of the market's doing X, so why do you want to do Y? It's like, no, the market's wide open, and I think we should do Y. What do you all think? In some cases, the company's like, no, we shouldn't do Y, we should do Z. But in other cases, they're like, yeah, go try it, see what happens. And then the market goes, oh, that worked well, we should follow. And yes, that made Microsoft, feel good about the investments we had made, because we did establish a leadership position by trying new novel approaches to things that, frankly, nobody had done. So there was no learning to do from other people.
At Microsoft, a lot of that focus was on things like data center efficiency and so forth. Obviously, there was a lot of work on campus in terms of lowering the impact. But what's the difference between working at CBRE on the built environment specifically, and what are the new lessons you're learning from that?
I think a lot of this stuff is behavioral. It's not, it has technical components to it. It's got business model components to it. There's a lot of things here. But I think changing behavior is the similar, like if I'd say what are the parallels, one of the top parallels is, how do you get around the other side of the table to whatever stakeholder you're working with? So whether that's tech, it's in the tech side, or where I am now, it's on real estate, and understanding, well, what's their motivation likely to be, and how do you actually change that? Right. So that's where I think there's huge parallels of saying, forget the topic areas and the actual specifics. How do you make it in people's self-interest to simplify the decision-making so that they move in the direction of sustainability, regardless if it's commercial real estate or data centers, which is kind of the intersection between my old world and my new world, or it's something else? And that is where I spend a lot of my time, is trying to unpack and understand, how do we change behavior at scale?
When we first talked, you mentioned that there were, some pretty straightforward changes a company can make to lower its impact. And based on both Microsoft and the CBRE experience, what would you recommend the first steps somebody who is on the other side of the table think about taking in order to make progress?
Well, the first step, and this holds true regardless of how mature or not a company is how good is your data? Right? So I think most people think, well, I've filed, or my predecessor has filed a carbon disclosure, or it's now project, or it's now called CDP, or I've complied with these regulations, or I've sent something to my shareholders and I have a CR report. And I think, oh, that reflects my carbon. But the reality is, when you really start to unpack it, most of carbon accounting today is based on math models, not based on actual data. So the first thing I sort of like to talk about with clients is, well, help me understand how you're gathering the data. And a lot of times the clients don't know. They go, well, I get this data and like I look at my energy use. I'm like, well, are you looking at energy use based on a model? Or do you actually have meters in all of your space? And it turns out most places don't have meters.
Yeah,
Like,
they probably never asked that question before.
right. And, I get it, which is if somebody gives you a piece of paper and says you've used so many kilowatt hours across 100 offices around the world, you tend to think, oh, that's what I've used. But the reality is actually often very, very different. So if we're not starting from that, then I can't tell you that building 1 versus building 21 has massive opportunities for improvement. I'm just guessing because that's not really your energy. So I've got to start with that fundamental tenet. Like, do we have real data?
So you need to be a sniper instead of using a shotgun to solve this problem first.
Yeah, but the patterns are pretty similar. So it is back to the behavioral thing, which is, hey, let's just have a conversation on what you know and what we think we know. And let's start understanding philosophically how you want to build your scaffolding to have a plan here. And the first thing is, how committed to you actually using real underlying data are you to get at the problem and the opportunity, right? Because once you start to unpack this, what is often true, people are actually overstating their carbon, right? Because they're using industry averages. Well, 50% by definition of society is below the average. And if you're in a room where you've already been focusing on sustainability and you're leaning in, the odds are pretty good that you're below the median point. So it's encouraging sometimes when people actually, and this is true even at CBRE when I started to dive into the data, is as we prepare our numbers for this year, we're finding that in a lot of places we had actually overstated our energy use and our carbon use.
So let's talk a little about CBRE's goal. You have a net zero emissions by 2040 goal. Where are you in terms of progress toward that?
Depends on where we are on the planet and which segment and which sector we're in.
Okay.
Right? And this is the nature of sort of, I'll call it nested goals, which is my company has a goal which is highly dependent on the behavior of our clients. So if you were a client of ours, I'd say, hey, I happen to know that you guys are super focused on sustainability, but if we came to you and said, hey, here's a pathway for you to get to net zero by 2030, 2035, whatever it is, you still have to make the decision to say, yes, CBRE, I'm going to undertake those behavior changes and or financial changes and or contracts to decarbonize my environment. I'm going to replace my lighting and replace my HVAC. And we can give you the information that shows you the economic model that says the IRR is high and the payback's great, but ultimately you have to make that decision.
So your goal, your net zero goal, is across not just CBRE's operations itself, but all of your clients as well?
Most of our clients, by and large, yes.
Okay. Besides carbon emissions, what else are you working to reduce in terms of the environmental impact of the built environment that you manage?
Yeah, so we've increased our investment in a couple of areas. One is circularity. So CBRE is also one of the largest construction. I think about project management of renovations of buildings all over the world. And so we've done a good job, but I think there's another level we can get to around circularity. That also ties back into not just landfills and waste, but it also ties back to carbon because you get a lot of carbon emissions when you're putting stuff in dumps.
Sure.
So that's an area. We are looking at water, depending on where we are, like in the UK, there are actually regulations which require our clients and therefore us as their advisors to work a lot on nature and biodiversity. There's a whole bunch of topics depending on where you are, where regionally you may have a requirement to do something that another part of the world doesn't even focus on.
Well, recognizing that geographic contextuality, what would you say CBRE's primary goals are? When you sit and talk about what the organization wants to accomplish, how much does beyond carbon, water, biodiversity, circularity play into the conversation?
They all play, but I'll just say that the lion's share is around how do we decarbonize the built environment across the globe. In one way, shape, or form or another, like CBRE touches about 7 billion square feet of real estate around the world. And when you look, and this is all public, if you look at our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and you add it all up, that's as much carbon as 2 Nordic countries combined. So wow. The scale is pretty large. And so when you go, hey, look, we have the opportunity to proactively get after trying to decarbonize the equivalent of 2 countries, that's really exciting, but it also puts into context the magnitude of what we're talking about.
Well, and does it also reflect the fact that basically heating the planet is the primary problem, the most urgent one we have to address, and so you're focusing on that?
Yeah, and it is also, it's not also, we could have an opinion. Like we could
Mhm.
just decide amongst a bunch of people inside CBRE, oh, X is more important than carbon. But our clients are saying, no, no, no. So we are a client-driven organization. So the world and our clients are hyper-focused on carbon.
Yeah.
And by the way, because carbon's fully tied to energy, they're also simultaneously looking at energy. And depending on how you want to frame the conversation, there's the cost of energy. So all these things are intertwined. And back to what I said just a few minutes ago, the kilowatt hour cost in most markets, not all, of renewable energy is now lower than the kilowatt hour cost of fossil fuel based energy. And that enables us to do new and interesting things that we couldn't have done 5 years ago.
Again, another place where the momentum is transforming all of the downstream opportunities. But as you mentioned earlier, starting off by measuring is really the most important step. So what technologies represent the best investment to help in that process? Is it smart thermostats? Is it monitoring?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different technologies. Full disclosure, we are partners with an investor in one of these, but like there's things that you can do. There's a company in California called Redaptive. They're all over the US. But basically, we're using them in our offices now, which says, hey, you've got a office and you don't actually know what your energy use is. It would be expensive and disruptive probably to put in a full sub-meter, like a meter. But they've created this really elegant technical solution, which allows you to basically think about putting clamps inside your panels. And every 5 minutes, it actually gives you readings on what's happening in your space. So we've deployed this, and we did literally an 80-20 rule. We said, look, how many offices, because we have 650 offices around the world, how many offices would we have to deploy this at to get to 80%? And so we focused on deploying these where we didn't already have sub-meters, deploying these. Now, there's another thing which isn't technical, which is in some cases, we discovered there were sub-meters in our space, but we didn't have access to the data because of our lease terms. So a big thing that we are focused on as a company is, this thing called green lease provisions, which is how do you write leases in a way which gives you the foundational pieces of information and also the economic incentives in many cases to share the burden and the savings with your landlord. So this is a big historical problem in real estate, the sort of landlord-tenant problem, which is the person who pays for the renovation may not always be the person who will benefit. And the time horizons are different. If you and I owned a building, we may say, look, we want to own this as a generational wealth family thing for our future. But the tenant's like, hey, I'm here for 5 years. So how do we actually deal with that non-parallel time horizon as well?
Well, and that raises this more general issue of how much do we need to monitor all of society in order to really understand our aggregate impact. One of the other areas that a lot of building management companies that I've talked with focus on is the coming and going of people and how much they cool or heat the office space and so forth. Is it important to track the employees, the staff's use of the environment in order to get a handle?
Absolutely. Well, and there's the other thing. I mean, I'll go back to my Microsoft days for a second, which is we had a number of our offices with sensors of people and people motion and use. And what we found is during certain months, not surprisingly August in Europe, we were able to shut entire floors and just reallocate people's space during those summer months to turn off. And, that's a massive electricity saving because you're talking about high heat days.
Interesting. So back to culture. If you don't have a culture of hoteling, in other words, you can move from office desk to desk in order to get your work done, but everybody covets their corner office with the view. You don't have the basis for making the cultural change that actually could reduce your energy use when the opportunity is just right there in front of you.
Yeah, and I do think in general, we're seeing this across the client base writ large, is there is much more hoteling today than certainly a few years ago.
Again, we're learning, if slowly, we're learning. So do you feel at this point that we have all the tools we need to address climate change? And if not, where do you see the gaps?
Tools is an interesting question. If I were to reframe it a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
which is, do we have the policies, the infrastructure, the scale we need? No.
Okay.
Right. So, but let's look at if we wanted to put solar on the rooftop of more buildings. Well, depending on the policies in a given state or country, we either find it to be a wonderful economic opportunity or a terrible opportunity. Technology is the same. It's the same solar panels. It's the same roof support systems. So the underlying thing is not the technology, it's the context.
So policy is consistently lagging. Is that simply a function
No, no. In some cases, it's the opposite. Like,
Okay.
I'm on the East Coast in New Jersey. The policy is great for these things called SRECs, and so it's created a boom for people to want to invest in solar in New Jersey. And it's not the only state. I'm just using that as an example, right? So policy cuts both directions. I mean, the IRA is a great example of how it's totally spurring a lot of innovation and a lot of investment.
This is a great conversation. I want to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. Now back to the conversation with Rob Bernard. He's Chief Sustainability Officer at CBRE Group Incorporated. That's one of the largest commercial real estate services companies in the world. And we're talking about the lessons that CBRE has learned on its own march to net zero carbon emissions by 2040. Now, Rob, in addition to solving your own problems, you're offering these services to business as CBRE Sustainability Solutions. They're designed to help companies, and this is what your site says, in the most pragmatic and cost-effective way possible. So what I wanted to ask is, do you find that when you're sitting down with a client for the first time that you can take a standard model and give it to them and say, this is the right way to do this pragmatically? Or is every business and every potentially every lessee different and therefore has a different definition of pragmatic?
It's a great question. So I think across a broad base of clients, and it's not just occupiers, it's also the landlord/owners, right? Is what are the patterns? Organizations tend to fall into those patterns. So while your company might be different than my company's still like 100 other companies, as is yours.
Right.
So that when we have that pattern recognition, and the question is, can we, and we think the answer is yes, can we create a process which is standard? And there what we said is, okay, what do we know to be true? We know that the outside world, the complexity is logarithmically growing. There's California regs now, the SEC, which may or may not get passed or may not get sued. There's this thing called CSRD, and if you're in certain countries, like I mentioned before, in the UK, you have biodiversity things. So the context in which you operate, especially if you're a global company, varies across the board. But what do we know? We need to actually map what you're trying to achieve and what you are legally obligated to achieve against your current state and then plan out your future state. So the first thing is to say, look, you've got this increasing complexity. Let's just simplify this and say, look, let's have a strategic blueprint. Literally just, what do I have to do by what time frame? It's 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050. That's kind of the standard time frames. Great. Now, how do we actually, let us, in fact, because we see this complexity all over the world, let us map you for all of your assets against everything that's happening in every market you operate in. And then that reveals, well, what work should I go do to intervene? Where do I replace lighting? Where do I go do repairs and maintenance and other things, which help me drive efficiency in an economic?
You know, what I hear are echoes of something that was a practice at Microsoft. We had a group called Patterns and Practices, which in order to build one set of software which would address as wide a range of companies and customers as possible, we applied patterns and we looked at the practices that they would be supporting. Are we also, as we become more digital and as we become, especially now that AI is on the rise, do we have a new set of tools and a new way of thinking that we need to propagate across the entire economy in order to really make it to turning around the climate crisis?
I don't know if it's a new way of thinking as much as it is a new set of tools to accelerate the outcomes, right? So if historically I would have been able to send a bunch of people to your building and have them crawl all over the building to come up with an assessment and say, hey, Mitch, here are the things that I generally think you should do. And now we're going to double click and like really go deep and have engineers. I can digitize a lot of that first step, right? So now I can look across 100 buildings in a fraction of the time it used to take me to look at one building. So while our outcome and our desire didn't change, our speed of execution changed dramatically. That's where I think the big transformation is going to come, which is, hey, if you had 1,000 locations, which a lot of our clients do around the world, or 10,000, and you wanted to look across all of your leases to know, like, well, where can I actually make interventions now? And how do I think about where I have opportunity? Imagine trying to do that manually, or even with search versus using AI to actually comb across these 10,000 leases. So those are the kinds of things I get super excited about, the advances in tech.
Now, one of the other services that you're offering is supply chain consulting, and particularly focused on reducing Scope 3 emissions, which are the toughest nut to crack. How are you engaging your own supply chain to collect emissions and other environmental data so that you can focus on reducing your Scope 3? I think a lot of people would like to hear about that.
Yeah, so we have this partnership and also an investment in this company out of Europe called Emitwise. And the general, just without getting too far in the weeds, the general problem with Scope 3 is that if you read the guidance, it is not only allowable, but pretty much the standard fare in most cases to do what's called cost-based carbon accounting.
Yeah, so every dollar spent was on the same amount of carbon.
So the example I always use is you got office furniture. I could go buy, in fact, I could go buy used equipment, which the carbon has already been spent for, let's call it 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Or I could go buy a new chair. Or I could go buy a chair that's made of upcycled materials. And all that matters in today's carbon accounting is how much did I spend?
Yeah. So
if I buy this great upcycled chair and I spend, let's say my budget is $1 million this year for office furniture, and I say, oh, I'm willing to pay a premium CBRE, I'm going to spend 1.2 million. And you come in and you say, hey, I only want to spend 800,000 because my, P&L is tough this year. I'm actually going to have more carbon than you, even if you bought a petrochemical based plastic piece of furniture with high carbon and high import, and I bought a locally sourced upcycled chair. That's the state that most people don't realize. And so what we say is, hey, we're going to help you mathematically move from one way of accounting to carbon to another. And then what that says is, oh, and that allows us to meet with your suppliers and say, look, if you want to continue to supply to our client, these are the things you're going to have to do in order to get over the sort of accounting principles and then actually make measurable improvement in your carbon.
That's a lot of leverage. How do the companies in the supply chains respond to that when you give them that sort of an ultimatum?
I think we'll find out over time. And it's less of an ultimatum, which is you're free to do whatever you want. Like,
sure,
you can write supply, and a lot of our customers will continue to buy services, but there is a growing chorus of companies who care about this. And so it's back to the conversation we were having just a little while ago about, like, look into the future, pick a date, 2030. Do you think most companies are going to want to know the Scope 3 implications of their supply chain, even if they don't today? The answer is probably yes. Great, let's start that journey now so that 6 years from now, you're not panicked.
Well, and if you're going to do more than $1 billion of business in California, you're just going to have to be able to report that. So for most companies, that's already a priority. One of the other areas that's interesting to me is that you both have to measure the embodied emissions associated with building a new building and compare the day-to-day operational impacts of running a building. How's that different, and how do you bring those two together in order to understand the entire impact, the life cycle impact of a building?
Couple things to keep in mind. If you just took an average, which I know is always dangerous to do, but if you took an average building and you're going to build a new building today, the amount of carbon involved in constructing and building that building is equivalent to running that building for the next 30 years. So the decisions you make up front basically have an equal impact to what you would do every day for 30 years. So that's the scale of it. Now, the flip side is 80% of the buildings that will exist by the year 2050 are likely already built. So a lot of this has to do with renovation, but let's take new buildings for a second. You got to make those decisions up front. And typically a company who's thinking about embodied or embedded carbon is also thinking about energy efficiency. So we're finding there's high correlation between those things. So they're thinking about, how's my building envelope look? Am I putting renewables on site, or at least have I built the infrastructure so that I can easily put solar on the roof and put batteries and have bidirectional energy and all this other stuff? So those two things are usually very, not surprisingly, tied together because you're either focused on this issue or you're not. And then all the decisions that stem from what you've decided to build are not only what's embodied, but how do those things perform in the built environment?
Pretty dynamic way to think about things. Do accountants rock this when they hear that kind of an explanation?
That's a good question. I have not spent a lot of time with accountants in this area.
Well, lucky you. We talked about renewables and the fact that the price is already below a fossil fuel generated kilowatt hour in terms of cost. And the question is, do you see that the grid is up to the challenge of bringing that renewable energy from all the places that previously were not connected with long haul, high capacity lines? Are you concerned about the ability to ramp up renewables in the face of the demand that you see in the commercial real estate space?
The market certainly thinks and is proving that it is a challenge. But part of the challenge, it's interesting, two somewhat diametrically opposed schools of thought on this. One is, especially with the rise of AI and data centers, that we're going to see a significant, in fact, a very significant increase in data center energy requirements around the world. That's a true statement, right? It's just
absolutely
straightforward now. So therefore, grids are going to start to fall over because of the increased excessive demand on data centers. At the same time, there's another school of thought that says, no. Most of these data center operators are thinking hyperscale, and they're thinking hyperscale in energy as well as in data. So if they built the infrastructure in a way that's synergistic with and can actually harden the grid and act as backup to the grid, and they can do things like batch computing based on availability of clean power, you actually have a more robust infrastructure than you have today. Now, the question is, how is this actually going to play out in the market? Because either of those outcomes could be true. And the truth will probably be, depending on where you are in the world, some variation of those two things. Mm-hmm. But the initial thing is to think, well, the default state is it's going to be a massive stress on the grid. The alternative view is more nuanced.
In terms of that progress, and there's absolutely no doubt that AI is going to drive a massive increase in energy requirements. Do you buy the idea that something like fusion will come online in time to fill that gap and keep the baseline load or the base load where it needs to be? Or are we looking at a crisis 5 to 8, 10 years out?
I'm not sure where fusion will be. And I think our crisis horizon is, I don't know if we ever hit the crisis horizon, but I think some people would argue it's nearer than that.
Should we be afraid of that?
No. I mean, innovation is motivated by several factors. And I think what we're seeing is the reason that we've crossed the threshold on renewable pricing versus fossil fuel-based energy is because we were hyper-focused on innovation. Part of the reason we were hyper-focused on innovation is it's also a good investment of capital, right? So fixing the grid or it's not actually fixing. I don't know if the grids are broken. Modernizing the grid.
Yeah, I think that's the right
transition. Last year I saw, I forget where it came out of, but it came out of an international body. About $1.3 trillion was spent globally on renewables and associated infrastructure. People aren't donating that money. Like, there's great economic returns, and some people will lose money. Some people will lose a lot of money. A lot of people will make a lot of money on hardening up the grid, creating the transmission lines, creating the tools and technologies to enable us to transition to a far more renewables-based future.
That International Energy Agency figure that you just quoted represents what we're doing on the business side. But I'm wondering, because you've been involved in this for 15 years, how have you taken what you've learned in your work and applied it at home? And what have you changed in terms of your lifestyle or where you source energy and so forth? I think folks would like to learn more about that.
Yeah, and so part of it is just pure coincidence. I moved from a suburban lifestyle where I had an electric vehicle to I now live in the city and I take a subway. So like just there, part of that had less to do about deliberate choices than about circumstance.
Sure.
Right. So cities are in general more efficient per capita than non-cities. Right. And then there's how do I actually source and how do I eat and how do I choose to do those kinds of things? And I'm pretty dialed in. But again, there's multivariate. And this is actually, I think, a good thing. It's multivariate. I have a very, I guess, low on the carbon footprint eating lifestyle, locally sourced fruits and vegetables, not fully, but largely vegetarian, which also happens to be good for the environment, but it's also great for cardiovascular health and everything else. This gets back to the same thing that I was sort of talking about early on, which is if you're thinking about things in a holistic manner, the reason to move more aggressively towards sustainability isn't just sustainability. It's economically good. It gives you more robust systems with longer lifetime and horizons. Like it improves work styles and quality of air for people. It's like These are multivariate things that contribute to great outcomes. And part of, I think, the challenge of sustainability has been people try to mono focus on sustainability as if it's the only beneficial outcome of behavior change. And that's not true. There are so many other huge benefits of the same behaviors that we have to do a much better job of packaging what we're talking about as being much broader than just sustainability.
I think that's an excellent point. You use the word multivariate. So the question I would ask is, does making these small changes in one's life, do you think, contribute to that greater outcome, that multiplier effect that we need in order to get to net neutrality?
Yeah, it depends on how many people do it. Like any individual in and of themselves is good and interesting, but it's the aggregate of literally millions and hundreds of millions of individuals because it sends a clear market signal, right? And we've seen that over the last decade, which is companies, not all companies, but in general, on average, companies who have focused on certain attributes around sustainability and environmental performance have tended to outperform those companies that have not. And that's not just random, that's driven by consumer demand.
You've been very generous with your time. How can folks follow your work and keep up with what CBRE is doing?
Well, I would say just we're actually in the process of revamping and launching a new website, but the CBRE sustainability website, and there's actually, depending on where you are in the world, there's places for you globally to reach out to us, and we'll get back in touch with you. But and they can also just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to put people on my network.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for spending time with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mitch.
That was my conversation with Rob Bernard, Chief Sustainability Officer at the commercial real estate company CBRE Group. And you can learn more about CBRE and its sustainability services at cbre.com. You know, there's a lot to unpack and translate for use in business, policymaking, and at home in what Rob discussed. As Albert Einstein said, doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, is the definition of insanity. And too many of us make negligible changes rather than determined adjustments to our lifestyles. But when we turn down the heat or the air conditioning just a few degrees to change our energy profile, or switch to a vegetarian diet first for a day a week, then 2 days, then 3 days, and then 4 days a week, these small changes begin to add up, and as Rob said, send market signals that change what is offered to us. So take a few minutes to learn more about how your home or office is heated or cooled, and then where the electricity is sourced, whether it's from burning fossil fuels or if it's renewable electricity. These are the kinds of measured steps that can lead to comprehensive change. Our transition to a sustainable economy is indeed a multivariate effort. We can contribute to the progress or hope someone else will do it while we continue to do the same old thing every day. And that is insane if we care about future generations. And I hope that you do. And here's an action you can take today. Share this podcast or any of the more than 460 interviews that we produced on sustainability in your ear by writing a review on your favorite podcast platform. That will help your neighbors find us, and they can take more action to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.